The 9003rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Turkey to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Pedersen, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and His Excellency Mr. Hossam Zaki, Assistant Secretary General for the League of Arab States. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Pedersen.
Madam President, I hope you can all hear me loud and clear. Good. I'm briefing you today from Geneva at the end of the fourth day of the seventh session of the small body of the Syrian Constitutional Committee. The committee has been meeting since Monday this week and concludes with its fifth and final day of meetings of this session tomorrow, on Friday. Before the committee began to work this week, I recall that Syria remains one of the gravest crises in the world, and there is a clear need for progress towards a political solution in line with Security Council Resolution 2254. Having passed this month the grim milestone of 11 years of conflict, and with the needs of the long-suffering Syrian people rising, I appeal to the committee's members to work this week with a sense of seriousness and a spirit of compromise that the situation demands. This week, the committee members have discussed draft constitutional texts on 4 titles of constitutional principles. Let me mention the 4 principles. It's basics of governance, state identity, state symbols, and today they are discussing the following: regulation and functions of public authorities. These are important subjects, and deliberations have, as you would suspect, not been easy. We are now at an important moment in the week's deliberations. In accordance with the co-chairs' agreement that led to the convening of this session, the delegations are expected to submit revisions to reflect the content of the discussions, and these are then to be discussed by the committee members tomorrow. We will therefore see if the next 24 hours help to move us forward. There are significant differences, but it is possible to find and build on common points if the will exists to do so. Serious attempts should be made by all delegations to begin to narrow differences. This requires taking on board aspects of points made by other delegations and entertaining compromise formulations that could in time attract support within the committee in accordance with its decision-making procedures. A constitution-making effort that actually starts to explore compromises could help build trust and confidence in this process, something sorely lacking among the Syrians at present. Madam President, turning to the situation on the ground, Martin will be briefing you on the growing humanitarian needs and the continued effects on the Syrian people of the destruction of so much of the country and the collapse of Syria's economy. I urge all concerned to take measures to reverse these negative trends, to expand cross-line and cross-border assistance, and to enhance efforts to early recovery to build resilience. Beyond the humanitarian sphere, there is much else that could be done to build trust and confidence, something that I continue to explore with all actors. After all, it is clear that no one actor or existing group of actors in Syria can determine the outcome of this conflict. A military solution is an illusion. This was always the case, but it is now plain for all to see. There have been no shifts in front lines for 2 years now. Yet this past month, violence has continued between the different Syrian actors, 2 listed terrorist groups, and involving 5 foreign armies too. With front lines frozen, there is every reason to try to de-escalate militarily and to build a true nationwide ceasefire. Likewise, with listed terrorist groups still a threat, parties share an interest and a duty to cooperate amongst themselves. Syrians on all sides continue to be affected by the plight of the detained, the abducted, and the missing. Any credible attempt to build trust and confidence must include serious steps forward on this issue, an issue that has been a priority of mine from day one and continues to be. There is also much more that could be done by the Syrian government on the one hand and by outside actors on the other to address the very real concerns that Syrian refugees and IDPs express, the very concerns which prevent most from returning: safety and security, lack of livelihoods and work opportunities, lack of adequate housing, as well as concerns over housing, land and property rights, military service requirements, and inadequate basic services. Madam President, I believe in areas such as these, and potentially others too, it should be possible to identify concrete, reciprocal, verifiable measures that could be taken in parallel and that could begin to shift conflict dynamics. And in the process, to explore how a broader political process could be constructed to tackle all the issues in Security Council Resolution 2254. I have already received some ideas, and I continue to develop others. There is now a need to deepen the discussion, and I will be carrying forward the consultations with that objective. The constructive international diplomacy needed to support this effort has not been made easier by recent heightened international tensions, but I will keep working on this. Madam President, let us also remember the impact of the Syrian conflict on the region. I'm pleased that you are hearing a briefing today from Assistant Secretary General Hossam Saki from the League of Arab States. Regional input and support for the UN-led effort to facilitate the political settlement will be critical, as will contributions from many other international stakeholders. That is why I continue to consult widely. This past month, I held consultations in Geneva with envoys of several states, traveled to Washington to brief officials of a number of states who met there under UN auspices, and traveled to Antalya, where I also was able to meet with the foreign ministers of Turkey and Russia, among other interlocutors. Madam President, I also continue to consult widely with Syrians as I pursue my mandate, and to value the insights and inputs I receive. The Women's Advisory Board met this past week and a half outside Geneva, and they continue to provide me with their perspective and ideas on the political process. Offering a gendered perspective, members of the board underlined ways to ensure that the aspirations of all Syrians are considered as the political process continues. I welcome their willingness to engage on tough questions. Earlier this month, We also convened in Geneva the thematic working groups of the Civil Society Support Room on the topics of civic space and values, as well as on the economy, recovery and development perspectives. Participants were keen to support our efforts to promote the functioning political process to implement Security Council Resolution 2254. Many are involved in local peace-building projects to promote a society based on common civic values of participation, plurality, equality, non-violence, and respect for rights and freedoms. They expressed their distress at the economic situation, which nourishes the war economy, and called on donors not to forget Syria and invest in early recovery efforts. Madam President, while I'm concluding, I want to emphasize once more that I continue to rely on all members of the Security Council to support my efforts in accordance with my mandate to bring about implementation of Resolution 2254, to restore the sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria, and to enable the Syrian people to realize their legitimate aspirations. Thank you so much.
I thank Mr. Pedersen for his briefing, and I'll give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Very much, Madam President. Thank you. This month marks 11 years of the war, destruction, and humanitarian crisis for the people of Syria. Such devastation finds few parallels in recent history. Over 350,000 people have been killed, and nearly 14 million people have been displaced from their homes. Basic services have been destroyed. 5 million children born since the start of the conflict have known nothing but hardship and nothing but war. These are terrible, sobering figures. Civilians continue to be killed and injured along frontline areas of northwest and northeast Syria, despite, as Geir has been saying, no significant movement in those front lines. In February alone, 18 civilians were killed in northwest Syria, according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We continue to be concerned about the situation, this deteriorating security situation in Al-Hol, where some 56,000 people live. Incidents resulting in death and injury, including of children, continue, as we have discussed in this chamber before. The protection of camp residents, most of them women and children, must be front and centre. And at the same time, we need to maintain the civilian character of that camp. I take this opportunity once more to call for the full repatriation of third country nationals from camps in northeast Syria. Madam President, each month the situation for Syrians becomes bleaker, as Geir has also mentioned, and this month is no different. As we reported here last month, 14.6 million people are in need of humanitarian aid, more than at any time since the start of the conflict. The graph keeps getting worse. Today's crippling economic crisis continues to push humanitarian needs to new heights. Very high levels of food insecurity, with 12 million people considered food insecure. That figure is at risk of rising further. And the Syrian pound is reaching record lows, reducing purchasing power. The war in Ukraine is leading to soaring food and energy prices globally, but it's expected to have a particularly negative impact on the region, including in Syria. And already food prices have hit record highs each month over the last 5 months, so they've gone up and up and up. Basic commodities are expected to become less affordable, but also less available. Families are increasingly unable to cover basic expenses with their incomes, as we have discussed here before, and only worse now. And all this exacerbates an already problematic humanitarian situation. Already as many as 1 in 4 children in some areas are stunted, resulting in irreversible physical and cognitive harm. Sadly, this also aggravates existing protection concerns. As in every crisis, the vulnerable suffer most. For example, 71% of communities, I find this an extraordinary report, 71% of communities have reported instances of child marriage. 84% of those communities report the use of child labour. Against this backdrop, while we focus on life-saving interventions, we must also intensify, again, as Geir has mentioned, our early recovery efforts. People must be allowed to lead dignified lives and see a better life for themselves and their children. We've seen positive work in early recovery across all sectors, from health to education to water and sanitation, including, Madam President, of course, from your authorities. Our 2022 humanitarian response plan, nearing finalization, includes $1.1 billion of projects. That's a bit over 25% of the overall request for humanitarian aid to Syria will go to early recovery and resilience, much, much more than was the case last year. So 570 projects in that plan are focused on early recovery and resilience. This includes, for example, 66% of education requirements, 45% of water and sanitation, and 22% of health requirements. So I'm very pleased that the programming has increased on early recovery and resilience, and of course we hope that this will also lead to generous funding. One important component of early recovery programs that needs to be expanded also is mine clearance. Mines and explosive ordnance killed 805 people, give or take, in Syria in 2021 and injured nearly 3,000 more. Around half of the population in Syria is estimated to live in areas contaminated with explosive ordnance. Again, a shocking figure. Access to electricity is also critical to enable early recovery. At present, 1/3 of Syrian households receive less than 2 hours of electricity a day. Public services, of course, similarly underserved. The UN continues to engage with all parties on how to ensure the situation of ordinary Syrians, which I have been describing, is not further exacerbated by the unintended impact of sanctions. Madam President, we cannot fail the Syrian people, and yet that is exactly what is the risk that faces us. There are two areas I would like to highlight that may protect us from these risks. First, we need funding, as I've already mentioned, including for those early recovery programs in particular. Last year, the humanitarian response plan received 46% funding. Itself a relatively good figure, but in a very grim environment. We're acutely aware of the rapidly rising humanitarian needs across the world, some due to man-made conflicts, others due to climatic shocks and extreme weather conditions. And with needs on the rise, the requirements for funding have skyrocketed. The funding environment is challenging, but we cannot allow insufficient funding, please, to be the cause of further hardship for Syrians, and in particular their children. Secondly, we must ensure full humanitarian access to people in need, wherever they are. I echo the call of the Secretary General to maintain consensus on renewing the resolution authorizing cross-border access for the United Nations and its partners. This Council has acted in unison on this issue since last July, and it's my sincere hope, obviously that of the Secretary General, that the same spirit of cooperation will remain on that issue. We continue to work with concerned parties to reinvigorate cross-line access to the Northwest. It is not an easy task. I'm hopeful that before the end of this month of March, we will see another interagency convoy delivering aid to people in need in that area. And in the Northeast, the UN must be able to coordinate the humanitarian response from within the country through our hub in Kamishli. Ultimately, now more than ever, we need action to show the people of Syria that they're not forgotten, as they fear that they are, and to deliver aid that is so urgently needed by those communities, those families, those statistics. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Griffith for his briefing. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Hussam Zaki. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Madam President. The 11th anniversary of the Syrian crisis coincides with a grave humanitarian, or rather global situation, which adds to the challenges facing the international community The Syrian crisis will not be immune to this situation, which cast a pall on international peace and security. We continue to hope that diplomacy will prevail over weapons and war. However, our concerns are growing, given the increasing numbers of displaced people in the war in Ukraine, which adds to the responsibilities of the international community. These include the need to address the humanitarian crises which continue to grow in tandem with the escalating nature of armed conflicts across the world. The Syrian conflict has created a humanitarian catastrophe which has affected all Syrians, regardless of where they are. The crisis has had intergenerational impacts. It has led to growing numbers of IDPs and refugees and has been affected by the worsening humanitarian and economic situation, rising poverty, worsening public health care as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the destruction of healthcare institutions, and the impact of sanctions which prevent these institutions from carrying out their basic tasks. It is estimated that 90% of Syrians now live under the poverty line. 12.5 million people are suffering from food insecurity. The conflict has displaced more than 12 million Syrians, around 50% of the population. This is a unique situation in our modern history. More than 14 million Syrians now require humanitarian assistance, in addition to tens of thousands of Syrians who are detained, kidnapped, or missing. Madam President, the League of Arab States is aware of the negative impact of this crisis on the stability of the Middle East and the Arab world in general. We have been following its effects on Syria's neighbors, especially those hosting Syrian refugees, notably Lebanon and Jordan. Lebanon and Jordan have been overwhelmed with the needs to provide aid and basic services to displaced Syrians, despite the burdens on infrastructure and vital services, especially education and healthcare. Lebanon hosts the largest number of refugees per capita. Jordan has hosted more than 1 million Syrians since the start of the conflict, which adds to the burden of an already overstretched country. The League hopes that the 6th Brussels conference to support the future of Syria and the region, scheduled for May of this year, will alleviate the humanitarian crisis and mobilize the necessary support for host countries. Madam President, support for refugees and IDPs is a shared responsibility between the international community and host countries without discrimination on the basis of color, race, or religion, as we have seen recently, unfortunately. Refugees and IDPs are humans, first and foremost, whose normal lives have collapsed for no fault of their own. Supporting them, showing solidarity to them, and extending aid to them is at the heart of the responsibilities of the international community. We hope that all stakeholders will carry out their role in this regard. Madam President, the Foreign Ministers' Council of the League of Arab States adopted on the 9th of March a decision on the Syrian crisis. Allow me to mention a few of the main elements in this decision, which forms the basis for the Arab position on the humanitarian crisis in Syria. First, there is a growing Arab concern over the deteriorating humanitarian situation and the possible catastrophic impact resulting from the continued violence across Syria, despite the lack of change in front lines in the northwest and the northeast of the country over the past 20 months. There is a need for stability, combating instability and insecurity, as well as assassinations and drug smuggling in the south of Syria to allow refugees to return voluntarily to their homes. Second, there is a legitimate concern over the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Al-Hol and Rukban. International and Syrian stakeholders are called upon to assume their responsibilities and allow for the safe passage of humanitarian assistance into Syria, while stressing the need for the return of all Rukban residents to their homes before dismantling the camp. Third, there is a justified and real concern over any new arrangements on the ground which may threaten Syria's territorial integrity. All attempts to impose demographic changes and create a new reality in Syria are categorically rejected, as well as the continued violation by Israel of Syria's airspace. Fourth, our Council welcomed the Security Council's decision, or rather Resolution 2585 of 2021, on renewing the humanitarian assistance mechanism. We call on donors to disperse their pledges as announced in previous pledging conferences. Madam President, we express our deep concern over the impact of the war in Ukraine on the Syrian crisis, whether on the ground or in terms of the way your Council deals with the situation in Syria. Given the global challenges resulting from the war in Ukraine, we hope that the international community will continue to address the humanitarian situation with the same level of interest. And we hope that purely political considerations will not prevent the Council from addressing the humanitarian aspects. Therefore, we hope that the Council will renew the cross-border humanitarian aid mechanism next July and avoid any politicization of this issue. We believe that renewing Resolution 2585 is vital for the fate of millions of Syrians in need. In closing, the humanitarian crisis in Syria will only be resolved through a comprehensive political settlement based on the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254 of 2015 in a manner that meets the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people. The political solution is the only solution to end the conflict and to provide for the safety and security to ensure the dignified, safe, and voluntary return of IDPs and refugees. The League of Arab States reiterates its support to the efforts of the Special Envoy, and we will continue to cooperate with him. Thank you.
I thank the Speaker for that statement, and I now give the floor to members of the Council that wish to make statements. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. This statement is on behalf of Norway and Ireland, the penholders of the Syrian humanitarian file. We thank the briefers, Special Envoy Pedersen, USG Griffiths, and Assistant Secretary General Saki for your sobering accounts on the humanitarian situation in Syria. Marking 11 years of conflict, death, and despair in Syria is a tragic milestone, one which sees the humanitarian situation continue to deteriorate. COVID-19, economic crisis, and drought are fueling the misery, and on top of that, increasing food prices. 12 million people in Syria are food insecure. families face an unthinkable choice between buying food or buying fuel for heating in the cold winter. The numbers of refugees, internally displaced people, and those in need of life-saving aid remains shockingly high. Those behind the figures include fathers, mothers, and millions of innocent children who have never experienced anything other than conflict. Negative coping mechanisms, such as child, early, and forced marriages, are increasing. And instead of going to school, many children are forced to work. A staggering 3 million children were out of school this month. Children are paying the highest price for this conflict. President, while millions of Syrians have found refuge in neighboring countries, and we thank those countries for their generous hospitality over all these years, over 14.6 million of those who remain in Syria need humanitarian assistance and protection. They need food, water, health services, electricity, shelter, education, and jobs. We must use all modalities to ensure that we reach out to everyone with humanitarian needs across Syria. For millions in the northwest, the humanitarian cross-border mechanism remains the critical lifeline for the provision of food, medical assistance, and shelter. The humanitarian cross-border mechanism is an irreplaceable tool for the reliable delivery of large-scale humanitarian aid month after month. It is also the modality which best ensures monitoring and transparency. The needs are massive, and the humanitarian imperative must be at the core of the response. This is why we have been supportive of the UN 6-month plan to deliver humanitarian aid across the crossline to the northwest. We urge all parties to facilitate access and contribute to progress in these cross-line deliveries. We also want to use this occasion to commend the humanitarian organizations, international and local, which are staying and delivering across Syria despite the extremely difficult circumstances. We call on all parties to allow and facilitate safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need. President, violence continues, including airstrikes, shelling, and the killing and maiming of civilians. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. And yet, since the start of the conflict, there have reportedly been 551 attacks on education facilities and personnel. These attacks are clearly contrary to Resolution 2601 on the protection of education in armed conflict, which this Council unanimously adopted. Finally, President, 11 years on, we must continue to stand together with the Syrian people in overcoming this desperate situation. Our key objective must be protecting and assisting the Syrian people. We welcome and support the increased focus on early recovery in humanitarian programming. And while continuing to address immediate humanitarian needs, we reiterate that only a credible political process can give the Syrian people back their future. We call on all Council members to do their part to this end. The Syrian people have suffered enough. President, I will now make a statement in my national capacity on the political situation. 11 years is 11 years too long for the Syrian people to have experienced upended lives and delayed futures. We urge all parties, both Syrian and external, to do all they can to reach a lasting political solution to end the war. Resolution 2254 must be implemented fully. Norway will continue supporting the Syrian-owned and Syrian-led political process, and we are encouraged that the Constitutional Committee is meeting in their 7th round of negotiation this week. We call on all participants to contribute constructively in good faith and with flexibility toward concrete outcomes and progress on a reformed constitution as an important part of the political process. We welcome also the UN Special Envoy's consultation with the Women's Advisory Board and Civil Society Support Room, and would like to emphasize their important roles. And we reiterate our support to the Special Envoy's step-for-step approach as a way to engaging all sides in identifying and carrying out reciprocal steps toward a political solution. President, let me also highlight the issue of persons who are missing or unlawfully deprived of their liberty. In Syria, they are inextricably linked and arbitrary detention is widespread. So many Syrians are personally affected by the countless number of missing and detained persons, not knowing what's happening to their families. Progress on this issue is critical. We call on all parties to allow humanitarian actors, such as the ICRC, to visit the detention centers and carry out their important work, providing information to the families of victims. Before concluding, President, let me reiterate Norway's commitment to the fight against ISIL. We have seen the last few months the group is still active and represent a real threat. The continued lack of a political solution allows them to operate. We must not let ISIL take advantage of the situation to further strengthen its position. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, Geir Pedersen, the head of OCHA, Martin Griffiths, as well as the Assistant Secretary General of the Arab League, Samzaki, for sharing their views. We welcome the commencement of the work of the 7th round of the Drafting Commission of the Constitutional Committee on March 21st in Geneva. We continue to see no alternative to advancing the political settlement process led and carried out by Syrians themselves with the mediation of the UN without external interference or imposing artificial deadlines and strictly within the framework of Security Council Resolution 2254. In this regard, we hope that the methodological reservations will not interfere with the successful completion of this round of the Constitutional Committee, and that the work will be based mainly on a dialogue between the Syrian delegations and their readiness to reach an agreement on constitutional reform. We call on Geir Pedersen to focus on this particular area without being distracted by other initiatives. Madam President, progress on the political track is also particularly needed now because the situation on the ground remains tense and potentially explosive. The main security threats in Syria and for the entire region are associated with the mobilization of terrorists who have taken refuge in territories not controlled by Damascus, in Idlib, east of the Euphrates, and in Al-Tanf. The solution to this problem lies in continuing to wage an uncompromising fight against internationally recognized terrorist groups, primarily ISIL and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as well as ending the illegal foreign military presence that violates the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic, and in the cessation of arbitrary Israeli airstrikes. The root causes of the general volatile situation lie in the West's continued policy of pandering to terrorists in an attempt to use them for their own aims. The latest manifestation of the dangerous consequences of this approach was a large-scale terrorist attack on Sanaa prison in Hasaka. During the operation to clear that prison and its urban environment from ISIL militants, U.S. aircraft and armored vehicles were used, and measures to protect civilians were disregarded, and the massive exodus of civilians from the combat zone is eloquent evidence of this. More than 45,000 people left the area, according to OCHA. Despite the fact that Washington presents its military presence as a counter-terrorist operation, we fail to see any active measures to combat terrorists there. Moreover, according to available information, ISIL and other extremists from east of the Euphrates are being transferred to other hotspots where it is beneficial for the U.S. to sow chaos. We also believe it is important to recall that the United States and their allies have repeatedly used the far-fetched pretext of destroying chemical weapons in violation of international law and the UN Charter to launch massive missile and bomb strikes on the military and industrial infrastructure of the Syrian Arab Republic. It would seem that this is what the rules-based order promoted by Western colleagues looks like. Given the aforementioned, and also in view of the fact that the UN Secretary General, in the context of the situation in Ukraine, has abandoned the customary neutral language that is appropriate for an international official, we ask Mr. Gutierrez to be consistent and to finally provide his assessment of the compliance of the presence of U.S. and other forces in Syria with the UN Charter. We expect him to publicly name those who are illegally occupying Syrian territory, primarily in Al-Tanf, and indicate who is responsible for the situation in IDP camps outside the control of Damascus. Otherwise, we will regard the silence of the Secretary General as a vivid example of double standards. We would also like to remind the Secretary General that we never heard his assessments of the U.S. bombings in Raqqa, Hachin, and Baghouz. According to the UN, there is not a single medical facility left in Raqqa that was not damaged as a result of the hostilities. The bombing of Baghouz killed at least 80 people, most of them women and children. After emotional assessments of what is happening in Ukraine, and assessments made on the basis of unverified or even unconfirmed information at that, the head of the UN is simply obligated to call a spade in the context of the ongoing U.S. occupation of Syrian territory based on information confirmed by international agencies. Madam President, on the humanitarian track, we share Martin Griffiths' assessment that every year the international community is letting down Syrians more and more. Implementation of Security Council Resolution 2585, meant to mobilize comprehensive humanitarian assistance to Syria, is stalling. The planned cross-line convoys from Aleppo to Sarmada have been blocked by militants in Idlib. At the same time, according to information we're receiving, al-Nusra is openly saying that until the next extension of the cross-border mechanism in July, which they are for some reason convinced will happen, they will not let through the domestic convoys delivering assistance to approximately 43,000 people in need. There is also no access to the other 3 zones of the Turkish operation. Even anti-COVID vaccines cannot be delivered. All this is being accompanied by an attempt on the part of our Western colleagues to link the obligations of member states under unanimously adopted Resolution 2585 to political preconditions. In parallel with the politicization of humanitarian assistance, Europe and the U.S. continue to suffocate Syria with unilateral sanctions, which are having a detrimental effect on the humanitarian situation and are significantly hampering the efforts of relevant organizations, including due to the chilling effect and overcompliance by banks, insurers, and economic actors. Again, haven't we ruled that using starvation as a method of warfare is unacceptable and contrary to international humanitarian law? We should not lose sight of the task of assisting Syrian IDPs and the return of refugees, which remains on the agenda. The receiving countries, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, are openly saying that their ability to host further refugees is limited. For our part, we consider it necessary to ensure the fundamental right of refugees to return as provided for by Security Council Resolution 2254 under the strict condition of coordinating such efforts with Damascus. Dear colleagues, as we're all aware, the mandate of the cross-border mechanism expires this summer. Only one of the provisions of that resolution is being implemented today, the cross-border humanitarian shipments. It seems no one intends to implement any of the other provisions. Yet, at the same time, Damascus has proven that deliveries to Idlib across the contact lines are quite possible. So humanitarian aid can reach the civilian population directly from the territory of the Syrian Arab Republic. We urge you not to forget this and not expect us to turn a blind eye to failures to comply with resolutions 2585, which are becoming more and more egregious. Thank you for your attention.
أشكر ممثل الاتحاد الروسي على بيانه
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for that statement. I now give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Special Envoy Pedersen, Undersecretary General Griffiths, and League of Arab States Assistant Secretary General Zaki for your briefings. 11 years after the beginning of the Syrian uprising and the start of the Assad regime's brutal war on the people of Syria, some in this council want to move on, arguing that the Security Council spends too much time discussing this issue. That would be a terrible mistake. Syria remains one of the largest and most complex humanitarian crises globally. We're still seeing active conflict and forced displacement. Some countries want to pretend the conflict is over, but the Syrian people sadly know better than anyone else that this is not possible. So let me be clear, the United States will not normalize relations with the Assad regime, and we urge states considering engagement or already engaging with the regime to weigh carefully the horrific atrocities visited by Assad on Syrians over the last decade, as well as the regime's continuing efforts to deny much of the country access to humanitarian aid and security. I'd like to focus today on three aspects of the conflict in Syria: the need for concerted political engagement by all sides, the importance of a nationwide ceasefire, and the need to reauthorize and expand the cross-border humanitarian mechanism to address the dire humanitarian situation. First, as we've heard, we meet as the Constitutional Committee is convening its 7th round in Geneva. We urge all parties to engage meaningfully, constructively, and in good faith. We expect all sides to offer revised draft texts tomorrow in an effort to find common ground, rather than arrive intending to provoke the other side. It is time for all sides to comment on one another's proposed texts. We fully support the work of Special Envoy Pedersen to advance progress towards a political solution in Syria in line with Resolution 2254. We also recognize and commend the role of Syrian civil society organizations to forge a political solution, including civil society members of the Constitutional Committee. And in the spirit of the ongoing Commission on the Status of Women, we want to welcome again the work of women-led groups to end the violence in their country, and we appreciate their attention to the disproportionate impact of conflict on women and children. Second, Madam President, we remain concerned about ongoing violence in Syria and reiterate the call for a nationwide ceasefire. Russia has fueled and perpetrated the conflict in Syria with reckless attacks impacting civilians and infrastructure. We are watching with horror as Russia uses some of the same barbaric tactics in Ukraine. Russia's relentless disinformation, including debasing the work of this council, and falsely alleging that other forces are responsible for these cruel attacks, whether in Syria or Ukraine, defies all credibility. It is disgraceful. We are also deeply troubled by reports that Russia has recruited Syrians to fight on its behalf in Ukraine. This would demonstrate Russia's true disdain for the Syrian people. Russia has hundreds of thousands of troops, but would instead send Syrians to die in President Putin's war of choice. Thirdly, Madam President, we remain focused on the humanitarian situation. As we heard from Undersecretary General Griffiths, an estimated 14.6 million people in Syria need humanitarian assistance, a 9% increase since 2021. This humanitarian crisis is the consequence of a conflict initiated by the Syrian regime and made tragically worse by that regime's continued interference with the international humanitarian response. This interference includes the rampant corruption of regime officials, endemic schemes to siphon aid, the regime's practice of favoring preferred communities and connected procurement companies, and its manipulation of exchange rates. Given the vast needs, our collective efforts must be focused on expanding aid access so it can reach all Syrians. This includes northeast Syria, where the availability of essential goods, including medical supplies, has decreased markedly since the closure of Yerubaya. The United Nations is facilitating the robust, transparent delivery of humanitarian aid into northwest Syria through its cross-border mechanism, which follows one of the most comprehensive risk management frameworks globally. It is essential that the Security Council renew and expand the cross-border mechanism authorized in Resolution 2585 this July. We continue to support efforts to facilitate cross-line aid, including by Turkey, but cross-line aid deliveries simply cannot match the volume of humanitarian assistance that is delivered cross-border. Moreover, Cross-line aid remains a risky endeavor as the regime and its backers continue to attack civilians and civilian infrastructure in northwest Syria and other parts of the country. We recommend any remaining skeptics of the cross-border mechanism visit Bab el-Hawa to witness for themselves the incredible volume of life-saving work made possible through cross-border assistance. Lastly, Madam President, I'd just like to respond to my Russian colleagues' comments regarding U.S.-caused civilian casualties. Russia's allegations of U.S.-caused civilian casualties through our counterterrorism efforts are brazenly hypocritical, given Russia's well-documented history of deliberately attacking Syrian civilians with utter disregard for human life. Russia itself has also supported regime attacks on critical infrastructure, including the Arshani water station in January. I think Russia's criticism is just a means to deflect attention from its own crimes in Syria and elsewhere. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France. Madam President, I thank Mr. Pedersen, Martin Griffiths, and Mr. Hossam Zaki for their statements. The war in Syria has lasted now for 11 years. The 15th of March marked a deeply sad anniversary. It was the 11th anniversary of the peaceful uprising of the Syrian people who were demonstrating peacefully and with courage to call for freedom, political reforms, and a government that respected and defended human rights. By way of response, the regime demonstrated staggering brutality and repressed these protests with blood. Yesterday, the Syrian women's movement organized on the margins of the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women a meeting on justice. These women gathered testimony from victims of sexual violence in Syria. These accounts supplement these studies conducted by the United Nations. The conclusions of both are clear. Sexual violence is a systemic practice of the regime. Bashar al-Assad is guilty of war crimes. To ignore these crimes is to jeopardize the possibility of a lasting peace. It is for this reason that France opposes efforts made to normalize the situation. Reintegrating Syria into the Arab League will not put an end to foreign interference or to regional instability. France will continue its fight against impunity. Those responsible of all crimes must be held accountable for their actions. The Syrian population continues to pay the highest price of this conflict. Since 2001, more than 350,000 civilians have lost their lives. Around 14 million people have been obliged to flee. They are still not yet able to go home without fearing violence, arbitrary arrest, and torture. The humanitarian situation continues to worsen. 14.6 million people now require humanitarian aid. Europeans have always answered calls for help. They were by far and away the first to provide aid in Syria since 2011, when the conflict began. Food insecurity is growing, and the loss of goods coming from Ukraine will continue to worsen that situation. International humanitarian law is not an option. It is an obligation which binds us all. The protection of civilians remains an absolute priority. It is also essential to guarantee full humanitarian access. The cross-border humanitarian aid mechanism continues to save lives. It will be necessary for it to remain for as long as aid fails to reach all those in need. The Secretary General was clear. Preserving this mechanism is a moral and operational imperative. Progress in terms of cross-line access must continue to be built upon, but let us be clear, such progress cannot substitute the cross-border mechanism. Only a political solution will make it possible to install lasting peace. This Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2254. It remains the only common pathway that we have to reach a political solution. No stakeholder alone holds the key to the end of this conflict. We reiterate our support for the efforts made by the Special Envoy to foster progress with the implementation of that roadmap. The political process must finally make progress, and each and every stakeholder must shoulder his responsibilities. First and foremost, The Syrian regime must do so alongside its Russian ally. The Constitutional Committee was created in September 2019. After more than 2 years of existence, concrete results must now emerge. Without a political solution, the French and European positions on the lifting of sanctions, normalization and reconstruction will remain unchanged. I thank the representative of France for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President, I thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen, USG Martin Griffiths, and the ASG of the League of Arab States, His Excellency Mr. Hossam Zaki, for their briefings. The small body of the Syrian Constitutional Committee is holding its seventh round of meetings in Geneva, which China welcomes. 11 years of war have shown that a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process is the only way out of the Syrian crisis. China calls on all parties in Syria to make good use of this hard-won opportunity to exchange views candidly and constructively, enhance mutual trust, and build consensus. Ahead of the session, the co-chairs had reached agreement on improving the working methods of the meeting of the body. China looks forward to the Constitutional Committee proceeding smoothly with independence and without external interference to achieve positive outcomes. The Syrian political process cannot justify the imposition of unilateral coercive measures. China commends the Syrian government for its active governance efforts and for carrying out national reconstruction in multiple areas to address the negative impact of unilateral sanctions on its economy and people's livelihood. Over the past period, the Syrian government has vigorously advanced the reconciliation, ensured agricultural production, supported the development of SMEs, completed a number of housing projects, and expanded vocational education for youth with positive results. Recently, the Syrian foreign minister discussed with the head of MS the issue of clearing landmines left over from the war. It is our hope that the two sides will strengthen cooperation, continuously improve Syria's security environment, create conditions for national reconstruction, and promote an early restoration of the normal order in the country. China has followed closely the humanitarian situation in Syria. As USG Griffiths stressed, the current humanitarian relief efforts should focus on supporting early recovery and reconstruction projects, maintaining the operation of water, electricity, education, and medical facilities, and ensuring basic services, which are also the requirements of Security Council Resolution 2585. China opposes attaching political preconditions to reconstruction and humanitarian assistance. We welcome the efforts by the Syrian government, UN agencies, and humanitarian partners to continuously increase the scale and frequency of cross-line humanitarian relief operations and call on relevant parties to give timely approval to applications for these operations and provide convenience to and ensure safety and security of humanitarian relief teams. I would also like to stress that Syria's oil resources belong to the Syrian people and that troops with illegal presence in Syria should immediately stop their acts of stealing and smuggling oil. Madam President, China commends UAE for inviting His Excellency Mr. Zaki, ASG of the League of Arab States, to give a briefing, which is an embodiment of enhanced communication and cooperation between the United Nations and the League of Arab States. Syria is a founding member of the Arab League and an important member of the Arab world. Syria's return to the big family of the League of Arab States will help forge a synergy for promoting regional peace and facilitate the early settlement of the Syria issue. It is China's hope that more and more Arab countries will resume dialogue, engagement, and cooperation with Syria. China will continue to support Arab countries in seeking strength through unity within the framework of the League of Arab States. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Pedersen, USG Griffiths, and ASG Zaki for their briefings. Madam President, last week marked the 11th anniversary of the Syrian conflict. We commend the Syrian people who courageously and peacefully took to the streets to demand freedom, political reform, and a government that respects and upholds human rights. The Assad regime met those demands with a brutal assault against them that continues today. This year's anniversary coincides with the appalling Russian aggression against Ukraine. Russia's inhumane and destructive behaviour in both conflicts is deplorable. As we have said many times, there can be no military solution to the Syrian conflict. We continue to support the UN-facilitated, Syrian-led political process outlined in Resolution 2254. We urge Council members to continue to call for a nationwide ceasefire, unhindered aid access, and conditions for safe refugee return. We commend Geir Pedersen for his continued efforts to facilitate a sustainable resolution to the conflict. He has our full support. After more than a decade of conflict, the Syrian humanitarian situation remains bleak. 14.6 million Syrians require humanitarian assistance, more than 80% of the population. 6.6 million Syrians are registered as refugees, and 6.7 million are displaced within their own country. Our hope is that Syrian refugees will eventually be able to return to their homes. But we agree with the UN judgment. Conditions do not currently allow this. It is essential that international law is respected and that any refugee returns are voluntary, safe, and dignified. It is a sad fact that as long as the conflict continues, humanitarian aid will continue to be vital for millions of vulnerable Syrians. And this is why the UK is clear in its position and commitment to the cross-border mandate under Resolution 2585. Madam President, the Council must be prepared to act and support the renewal of this resolution in July. In the meantime, we call on all parties to fulfil their international obligations and ensure access to humanitarian aid. The United Kingdom continues to oppose engagement with the Assad regime in the absence of behavioural change. Ceding legitimacy to Assad's unreformed, unrepentant and unreliable regime for nothing in return will undermine efforts to end the conflict and prolong the suffering in Syria. Finally, on the Constitutional Committee talks taking place in Geneva this week, we encourage all parties, especially the Syrian regime, to meaningfully participate. Urgent progress is needed, and we urge the regime's backers to redouble their efforts to find a way forward. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President, and I would like also to thank the Special Envoy Pedersen and USG Griffiths and Assistant Secretary General of the League of Arab States, Osam Saki, for their briefings. 11 long years since the conflict started, and it is still profoundly disturbing to see how Syria continues to sink. 11 years ago, the Syrian people took to the streets to call for an end to the kleptocratic, repressive Assad regime, and the regime responded by killing them. Today, there is no space for aspiration or hope in Syria. The Assad regime has disfigured Syria. It is disturbing to listen to the data shared by the briefers on the humanitarian situation. We express concern about the continuing suffering of the Syrian people and the dramatic and worsening humanitarian situation. We stress the importance of unhindered access to life-saving humanitarian assistance through all modalities, including through the reauthorization of cross-border humanitarian aid delivery, to which there is no alternative, as well as cross-line aid and early recovery projects consistent with Resolution 2585. We continue to call for a nationwide ceasefire and respect for international humanitarian law. We underline the need for the Council to act on expanding cross-border access to elevate the suffering of Syrian people. All parties to the conflict must uphold their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law, including ending attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructures, and facilitate an unimpeded humanitarian access to civilians trapped or displaced by fighting. We urge continued support to Syrian refugees and host countries until Syrians can voluntarily return home with safety and dignity in line with UNHCR standards. All returns of refugees and other displaced Syrians must be in accordance with the principle of non-refoulement. Syrian authorities must ensure the protection of all returnees. Madam President, Council Resolution 2254 provides the basis for real, inclusive political transition with the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women. The full implementation of Resolution 2254 must therefore be an absolute priority for this Council, a priority the Syrian regime has disregarded in the past and continues to disregard as we speak. The Constitutional Committee is the only existing platform to envisage and pursue political transition, but so far it has produced mainly disappointment. And this is primarily due to lack of genuine involvement and investment from the part of the Syrian regime. The Constitutional Committee is meeting in Geneva for its 7th session, and we hope that it will bring concrete results, but we do not anticipate any tangible progress. We reiterate that absent constant pressure from the Council, and in the absence of any timetable and deadlines, the Constitutional Committee risks becoming a smokescreen for inaction and for keeping the current status quo. In concluding, we support the tireless work of Special Envoy Pedersen to consult with key stakeholders to move the political process forward. He also deserves the full backing of the Council to put pressure on the Assad regime to advance with the political process. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Albania for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3, Gabon, Ghana, and Kenya. We thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen, USG Martin Griffiths, and Her Excellency Hossam Zaki for their briefings. We also welcome the participation of the representatives of Syria, Iran, and Turkey. Our statement will focus on the political, security, and humanitarian situation in Syria. Madam President, 11 years since the armed conflict in Syria, the situation remains grim and deeply concerning. We are reminded that unnecessary violent conflict has claimed thousands of lives, generated millions of refugees and internally displaced persons, ignited a humanitarian crisis of historic proportions, and impoverished an entire population of a country that once knew peace and progress. Today, Syria is struggling to regain its footing under the most difficult of circumstances. Its people need our support, particularly in their quest for political solution that takes into consideration their peace and security. The A3 is pleased to note that the Special Envoy convened the 7th round of the Constitutional Committee meeting, which is ongoing this week in Geneva. We commend the parties for the resumption of these crucial discussions and encourage a constructive engagement on the revisions of the draft text that will hopefully yield tangible progress. We hope that the parties can make commitments to hold more regular meetings in the coming weeks to create a momentum in the search for a lasting solution. The A3 is in support of other innovative efforts aimed at moving the political process forward. These include addressing the situation of detainees, including facilitating the release of the detained vulnerable, particularly the elderly, women, and children, as well as clarifying the status of missing persons, which would be a significant confidence-building measure. We take note of the Special Envoy's ongoing consultations on a step-for-step approach. It is important that this approach is implemented in accord to international law and international humanitarian law. The A3 encourages the role and support of regional actors and reaffirms the need to bear in mind that Resolution 2254 remains the foremost roadmap to achieving the desired political solution to the Syrian crisis. We must emphasize that all political initiatives should be inclusive and take into account the voices of the widest spectrum of the Syrian society, including women, youth, minority groups, as well as civil society. Madam President, on the security situation, the A3 condemns the unrelenting violence that continues in the front lines in northwest Syria. Despite the temporary pause in attacks in recent weeks, we are deeply concerned by the frequent shelling and airstrikes, as well as mines and unexploded ordnances. We underscore the imperative for decisive collective actions to combat Security Council listed groups such as ISIS and the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. This is the foremost way to ensure that the victims who have endured suffering for far too long get justice. As we have stated before, there is no military option to ending the Syrian crisis. We therefore reiterate our call on all parties to adhere to the nationwide ceasefire. We also stress the imperative for the protection of civilians, humanitarian workers, and civilian infrastructure in accordance with international humanitarian law and relevant UN resolutions. This, Madam President, leads me to the humanitarian situation. The A3 remains gravely concerned by the millions of people in dire need. To reach these people, the cross-border aid mechanism, complemented by cross-line deliveries, should be sustained. In particular, we look forward to more frequent cross-line deliveries in a predictable manner. We call for the urgent and special attention to be accorded to the people residing in Rukban in southwest Syria. Their humanitarian situation is worsening, and assistance to them must not be impeded. To ease the colossal humanitarian burden in camps, we call on states to repatriate their citizens, especially women and children, in camps, including the Al-Hol camp, in a safe and dignified manner in line with the standards of international humanitarian law. Madam President, the A3 is concerned by the implication of global food prices as a result of the conflict in Ukraine, which is plunging already fragile and food insecure countries, particularly those in conflict situations, deeper into vulnerability. It is essential to undertake measures to mitigate the humanitarian impact of the situation in Ukraine, including by ensuring that the international community's humanitarian response remains adequately funded. Furthermore, and given the dire economic situation marked by vast food insecurity, we urge all actors to support economic recovery measures as a key component to the longer-term peace that Syria and the region need. The A3 also encourages support to the early recovery and livelihoods activities under the United Nations humanitarian response, which is fundamental to assisting Syrians to getting back to their normal lives. To conclude, Madam President, the A3 underscores that consensus on both the political and humanitarian tracks is more crucial now than ever before. All concerned parties, including foreign powers, must put their multiple competing interests to the side and demonstrate that the multilateral system can still be relied on as an effective mediator of global peace and security. Once again, we reaffirm our respect for Syria's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. The A3 stands in solidarity with the people of Syria in their quest for peace, which can only be delivered by a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process with international support. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement. I give the floor to Mexico.
Madam President, I thank Special Envoy Pedersen, Under Secretary General Griffiths, and Assistant Secretary General Zaki for their briefings. I welcome the delegations of Syria, Iran, and Turkey. There can be no doubt that the highest price for these 11 years of conflict has been paid by the civilian population. Around 14 million people have found themselves forced to leave their homes, and more than 350,000 people have lost their lives. With every day that passes, the international community falls into ever deeper debt with the Syrian people in not proving able to put an end to the suffering of millions of people. These 11 years have left deep scars in the social fabric. The role of civil society is key in rebuilding social cohesion in the country. Consequently, we commend the efforts of the Special Envoy to maintain regular contact with the Women's Advisory Board, as well as with other Syrian social organizations. We will never tire of emphasizing that there is no military solution to the conflict in Syria. The only pathway possible is that of political dialogue which enjoys commitment of all parties. It is for this reason that we hail the convening of the 7th meeting of the small body of the Constitutional Committee, which is currently underway. And we reiterate the appeal to parties to participate in a serious and committed fashion in the work facilitated by the Special Envoy Pedersen. The Constitutional Committee is one of the avenues available to forge ahead in the political transition with social reconciliation and eventually to build a lasting peace. It is one of the components of Resolution 2254, which is the roadmap we have to achieve lasting peace in Syria. We take note of the most recent report of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism for Syria, and we appeal to all member states to cooperate with the aforementioned mechanism. We also emphasize the work that national courts have conducted to investigate and try those responsible for atrocities. On the humanitarian track now, it is alarming that the needs of the population are at the highest level they have been since the beginning of the conflict. The rising cost of the basic basket places families before difficult decisions which nobody should have to make. Moreover, we note other factors which could have negative repercussions on the situation where food supply is concerned. These include the increase in fuel prices and the effect that the conflict in Ukraine might have on the basic grain supply. In the face of this reality, the cross-border crossing point of Bab al-Hawa remains vital for the survival of millions of people in the northeast. Mexico also recognizes the value of cross-line operations. It is for this reason that Mexico agrees with the Secretary General that both mechanisms are necessary and that they complement each other. With that in mind, the very minimum that we can do is preserve the consensus which was reached last year with Resolution 2585. As the Secretary General stated, this is a moral and humanitarian imperative. There is no doubt that other elements, such as early recovery projects, are also vital to mitigate the effects of more than a decade of conflict and to contribute to building resilience in the country. Madam President, I conclude once again by once again reiterating the importance of a national ceasefire. Streets, hospitals and schools in Syria are not battlefields, and these spaces must be respected and protected. Many thanks.
I thank Mexico, and I give the floor to Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President, and I'd also like to thank our three briefers today for their informative briefings. I will confine myself to speaking on the political situation, as the Ambassador of Norway has already spoken on behalf of Norway and Ireland as the co-pen holders on the humanitarian file. Madam President, this month marked 11 years of conflict in Syria. 11 years and more than 350,000 people dead. 11 years and at least 100,000 disappeared. 11 years and a country devastated. Syrian children have paid and continue to pay the heaviest price. Almost 13,000 children in Syria have been killed and injured since 2011, and a generation of Syrian children have grown up knowing nothing but war. If we continue on this current trajectory, the multitude of worst-case consequences for Syria will be an inevitable reality. It is critical now, more than ever, that the parties adhere to a permanent nationwide ceasefire in line with Resolution 2254. Madam President, Ireland fully supports the efforts of Special Envoy Pedersen on the political track. We welcome the convening of a 7th round of talks of the small body of the Constitutional Committee this week in Geneva. And Ger, we wish you well with tomorrow's concluding session. However, unless there are genuine attempts to narrow differences, especially by the Syrian authorities, progress will not be possible. Thank you also, Ger, for the update on your ongoing contacts with all parties towards a lasting political solution in line with Resolution 2254. I repeat Ireland's call on all parties, particularly the Syrian authorities, to cease all indiscriminate attacks and direct attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Furthermore, I reiterate our calls for the release of those arbitrarily detained, for the fate and whereabouts of all those forcibly disappeared to be revealed, and for independent monitors to be ensured access to all places of detention. This month, we mark International Women's Day. I would like to pay special tribute to the women of Syria, who have shown incredible resilience and leadership, including in their local communities. Syrian women have an indispensable role to play in shaping the future of their country, and they must be fully and meaningfully included in all aspects of the political process. Their participation is key to securing sustainable long-term peace. Thank you, Ger, for your ongoing engagement with the Syrian Women's Advisory Board. Madam President, grave violations of fundamental human rights and humanitarian law, including torture and sexual and gender-based violence, continue to be documented across Syria. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria and the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism play a role in documenting these crimes, which is essential for the pursuit of justice and accountability. I would like to underscore Ireland's unwavering commitment to fighting impunity and ensuring that those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria are held to account. Truth, justice, and accountability are the right of the Syrian people. They are essential for any political solution to be sustainable, to build trust, and to ensure that violations never occur again. In closing, Madam President, the international community, and in particular this Council, has a duty to ensure that the victims and survivors of Syria are never forgotten, and to send an important message that justice will prevail and that war crimes, wherever they have been committed in the world, will not go unpunished. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Ireland, and I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you. Madam President, I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Under Secretary General Griffiths for their informative updates. I also welcome the Assistant Secretary General of the League of the Arab States to this Council, and I thank him for sharing the League's insights into the Syrian crisis. I welcome the delegations of the Syrian Arab Republic, Turkey, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Brazil looks forward to hearing the outcomes of the discussions of the 7th session of the Small Body Constitutional Committee convened this week in Geneva. We really hope a spirit of cooperation and commitment to progress prevails during the talks, in line with its drafting mandate established by Resolution 2254. In that regard, Brazil restates its conviction that only a Syrian-owned and a Syrian-led UN-facilitated political process with due regard for the preservation of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity will bring lasting peace and alleviate the suffering of the Syrian population. We thank Mr. Pedersen for his tireless efforts to engage key international actors and for his genuine efforts to foster trust among the parties in order to move us away from the current stalemate. The enduring worsening of the situation on the ground serves as a clear reminder that it's high time for the political dialogue to show practical results to relieve the suffering of the Syrian people. As the conflict in Syria has entered its 12th year, the protection of civilians remains a significant concern. Food insecurity has reached its highest level on record, and electricity provision is severely compromised, affecting basic services. Brazil echoes the calls for an immediate nationwide ceasefire and for early recovery initiatives that can rebuild civilian infrastructure essential to the provision of basic services such as health, education, electricity, water, and sanitation. We support assessments of the impact of sanctions on the daily life of the civilian population, particularly the vulnerable groups. Humanitarian exemptions for any sanctions must be strictly observed to ensure that they do not undermine access to food, shelter, and essential health supplies for those most in need. Countering terrorism activity in Syria should continue to be a priority. And we must not forget that poverty and political instability constitute fertile ground for extremist forces. Madam President, life-saving international aid to the Syrian people, especially to those living in camps and informal settlements, is still paramount, both in cross-line and cross-border modalities. Brazil underlines the importance of keeping cross-border humanitarian operations under close monitoring and of collaboration between all parties for the expansion of cross-line operations so that they can be conducted in a safe, regular, and predictable manner. To conclude, I reiterate that Brazil fully agrees with the Special Envoy in his understanding that a military solution is an illusion, evidenced in the practice by frozen front lines and a persistent stalemate on the ground. All parties must accept this reality and start working to put an end to this gruesome conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil, and I give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Madam President. I join others in thanking Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths, Assistant Secretary General, League of Arab States, Mr. Hossam Zaki, for their updates. A few days ago, we marked another tragic anniversary of the Syrian conflict. India has been consistent since the beginning of the conflict that imposing external solutions cannot help in the resolution of the conflict. It is for the Syrians to determine and decide what is best for Syria and their own future. The Special Envoy has been making efforts to bring all sides together and facilitate the political process in line with Resolution 2254. We support his proactive diplomacy, particularly recent efforts to reinvigorate the UN-led process. Towards this end, we welcome the convening of the 7th session of the small body of the Constitutional Committee in Geneva earlier this week. We hope that the three sides will come to a preliminary understanding on the 4 principles, that is, basics of governance, state identity, state symbols, and regulation and functions of public authorities. India has also been consistent in calling for supporting regional efforts to find long-term solution to the conflict. The progressive normalization of Syria's relations with its Arab neighbors in the recent months is an encouraging development. On the security front, we remain concerned with the overall situation in Syria. While the front lines remain unshifted, the violence has continued in several places, particularly in the northwest and northeastern parts of Syria. There have been reports of shelling, skirmishes, and security incidents across front lines, including increasing incident of ceasefire violations. There is an urgent need for serious efforts towards a comprehensive ceasefire in Syria. Towards this end, we believe withdrawal of foreign forces is essential to realize the objective. India has also been repeatedly calling for attention to the looming threat posed by resurgence of terrorist groups in Syria. UN-designated terrorist groups such as ISIL and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham are gaining strength not just in Syria but in Iraq as well. We reiterate that global fight against terrorism cannot and should not be compromised for narrow political gains. As the conflict in Syria enters its 12th year, the basic needs of the Syrian people continue to be unmet. While the focus of the international community is shifting to humanitarian crisis arising out of conflict in Ukraine, it is important we don't lose sight of Syria and suffering of Syrian people. Madam President, there is considerable scope for expanding cross-line operations in the Northwest. We continue to encourage OCHA and other UN agencies to expend efforts to enhance cross-line operations. We also continue to believe that it is critical to achieve progress on implementation of Resolution 2585 concerning early recovery and infrastructure, not only on humanitarian grounds, but also in the context of building trust and confidence. The support of the international community to address the economic and humanitarian challenges remain integral to the success of the political process. In conclusion, Madam President, on our part, India has continued to extend developmental assistance and human resource development support to Syria. We welcome Syria joining the International Solar Alliance last month. India will continue to support the people of Syria in their endeavor for peace, stability, and economic recovery. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Arab Emirates. I would like to thank both Mr. Geir Pedersen and Mr. Martin Griffiths for their important briefings. I also welcome the participation of Mr. Hossam Zaki, Assistant Secretary General of the League of Arab States, and thank him for his valuable briefing, which highlighted the impact of the Syrian crisis on neighboring Arab countries. We would like to note that the last briefing by the League of Arab States to the Council on Syria was in 2012. It is important to strengthen cooperation between the Council and the League to find Arab solutions to Arab crises, including Syria, since its stability is an essential pillar of Arab security. To address the political situation, the UAE believes that there is an urgent need to find practical and effective solutions to end the Syrian crisis, especially considering that the war in Syria has entered its 12th year, resulting in more than 6.5 million refugees worldwide. This can be done by adopting a practical and logical approach. We seek diplomatic solutions to crises and call for an effective Arab role to discuss ways to solve the Syrian crisis instead of merely managing it. The Syrian president's recent visit to the UAE is a result of that approach. We continue to support the efforts of the United Nations to reach a political solution in accordance with Resolution 2254, including the efforts of Mr. Geir Pedersen to converge regional and international political views on addressing the effects of the Syrian crisis. We also welcome the convening of the 7th session of the Constitutional Committee, as well as the positive developments regarding the agreement to discuss the constitutional principles in the past few days. Further progress requires all parties to continue engaging in dialogue in good faith and to take tangible steps in that direction. As we call for strengthening the Arab role in Syria as part of the efforts to end the crisis, we also renew our rejection of foreign interference in Syria, whose sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity must be respected. Turning to the humanitarian situation, we re-emphasize that it is unacceptable to leave the Syrian people, including those who are displaced, to face horrendous conditions in which they lack the most basic needs, such as electricity, food, and drinking water. Syrian children have been particularly affected by these conditions, since most of them have lived through the atrocities of war and its consequences. The worsening of the economic situation affects every Syrian citizen. The World Food Programme reports that food prices in Syria have risen to unprecedented levels over the past few months, causing a further deterioration of the humanitarian situation. Regarding the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, providing medical supplies to the Syrian people remains a priority for the UAE. Approximately 6% of the country has been fully vaccinated, which requires greater attention from the international community. In this regard, the UAE has completed the construction of 2 field hospitals in Damascus and Aleppo to treat those infected with COVID-19. Additionally, we have also completed a vaccination program for Syrian refugees in Jordan, which sought to vaccinate 12,000 refugees in the Emirati Jordanian camp in Murajib al-Fuhud, as well as the camps of Zatari, Azraq, and al-Hadika. We also underscore the importance of providing support to Arab countries affected by the Syrian crisis, especially assisting them in providing basic services to refugees. These are the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, the Republic of Iraq, the Republic of Lebanon, and the Arab Republic of Egypt. The UAE underscores the importance of continuing the delivery of humanitarian aid across the border into Syria, in accordance with Resolution 2585. All concerned parties on the ground must cooperate to ensure that humanitarian aid through cross-line operations reaches those in need. In conclusion, a political solution to the Syrian crisis is still possible, especially when we combine efforts to overcome current obstacles. We must move away from merely managing the crisis and move towards solving it, in order to meet the aspirations and basic needs of the Syrian people. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Shukran.
Thank you, Madam President. This month, multiple countries hostile to Syria have hurried to issue statements commemorating what they called the 11th anniversary of the Syrian Revolution. In reality, though, it is the 11th anniversary of the aggression by the United States, Britain, and France and their allies against Syria through their terrorist proxies, secessionist groups, economic sanctions, coupled with an immense propaganda campaign that spread lies, disinformation, and fabrications. Ladies and gentlemen, the Syria against which this war was waged is the epitome of history and civilization, coexistence and tolerance, resistance and heroism, progress and development. It has been targeted by the forces of evil, hatred, obscurantist, destructive forces, forces of ignorance and underdevelopment, treason and disloyalty, to obstruct the Syrian Renaissance, to destroy the development gains, to shed the blood of its people that have defended its dignity, sovereignty, and unity, and to undermine its regional and international role. Yes, the Syrian people did start a revolution, but not 11 years ago. 100 years ago, when it revolted against the Ottoman occupier, then against the French occupier, until it gained its full independence with its bravery and heroism. It then launched a revolution against injustice and obscurantist ideas, ushering in a phase of comprehensive transformation, leading to decades of stability and laying the foundation for development and modernization. Madam President, expressing concern is a phrase often used by these countries in their statements. What we really should be concerned about are the practices of American occupation forces, their support to secessionist militias in the northeast of Syria, their collaboration to violate Syrian sovereignty and to steal national resources. We should be concerned over the practices of Turkish occupation forces, their support to terrorist groups in the northwest of Syria, their audacious interference in the internal affairs of Syria. The grave concern we should all be expressing should be over the continued and repeated hostile Israeli attacks against Syrian sovereignty, the casualties and harm they leave in their wake, the direct threat they constitute to the peace and stability of the region. Ladies and gentlemen, do their statement contain any expression of concern over such practices that violate the Charter of the United Nations and relevant Security Council resolutions? Of course not. Madam President, the phrase "stop the violence" is another one that makes regular appearances in their statements. Although they incite to violence every day through pressure, intimidation, and manipulation of societal values, they fuel violence through their hostile practices, through recycling terrorist operatives and foreign thugs that they brought with them from all over the world, and now they refuse to take them back and their families to the countries of origin, to their countries of origin, to prosecute them. Over the past 11 years, they've shed tears over the suffering of the Syrian people, but they're denying that this suffering is a result of their failed policies, their aggressive actions, their inflammatory statements, and their hypocrisy. The humanitarian suffering of the Syrian people started when those countries undermined the peace and stability enjoyed by Syrian citizens, when they used criminal and terrorist operatives to wreak havoc and to spread fear and terror, to destroy vital infrastructure and development gains, when they imposed unilateral coercive measures, and they're now repeatedly threatening to impose more of those measures. Those aggressive policies are the reason for the migration waves and refugee waves. They prevent Syria from creating the necessary conditions for their safe and dignified return to their homes. This would put an end to their suffering. The Turkish regime is striking deals to obstruct Syrian efforts. Today, these countries are obstructing all local, regional, and international efforts to rebuild what their dirty war has destroyed, to start early recovery projects that would allow Syrians to be more resilient, that would help them stay in their country rather than migrating or seeking refuge, that would encourage those who left to come back. Madam President, those countries are calling for a political solution in Syria, but this is hypocrisy and political bidding. Those countries are pushing for their idea of a political solution, one that does not respect the will of the Syrian people and its national choices, one that would perpetuate the Syrian crisis and would obstruct reaching a genuine solution. They're interfering in what is under the exclusive purview of the Syrian people. They're imposing military and political frameworks that are inconsistent with the history, societal and cultural values of the Syrian people and the challenges that it is facing. And when they do speak of accountability and impunity, they do not by any means mean accountability for their crimes, their aggression, their violations, their support to terrorism, their sponsoring terrorism. Justice, in the perspective of those countries, is a selective concept to be achieved by politicized, inadequate mechanisms imposed through pressure to serve their own interests and agenda, or through manipulating the fundamentals of international law, resorting to distorted interpretations and other immoral concepts. To those we say, shedding the blood of the Syrian people, destroying their achievements, stealing their resources, those are crimes for which you must be held accountable. They will not go unpunished. Madam President, my delegation had to give a comprehensive overview of what has transpired in Syria over the past 11 years. At the same time, we are committed to make all efforts to improve the humanitarian situation, to provide the basic health and education services, to improve the living conditions for Syrians. We are committed to working with the United Nations and international partners, including through enhancing the delivery of humanitarian aid from within Syrian territories and implementing early recovery projects and creating the conducive conditions for a dignified and voluntary return of the displaced to their homes. Madam President, the Syrian Arab Republic is committed to a political solution that is based on an inter-Syrian national dialogue, a political process that is Syrian-led and Syrian-owned, without any foreign interference, which would fulfill the aspirations of the Syrian people, a process that would fully respect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria. The Syrian government has made commendable efforts to achieve reconciliation and peace, including through local reconciliations in a number of cities and areas in Syria. In implementation of the amnesty decrees issued by the President of the Republic, they allowed thousands of Syrians in Syria and outside, allowed them to return to their normal life. My delegation welcomes the 7th session of the Constitutional Committee. We commend the positive, constructive engagement of the Syrian delegation and its commitment to fulfill the aspirations of the Syrian people. We reject any foreign interferences in the work of the committee, any attempts to obstruct its work. We reject the imposition of predetermined outcomes or artificial timelines. In closing, restoring peace, security, and stability in the Syrian Arab Republic will only be achieved if these Western countries abandon their hostile policies against my country, if they stop sponsoring terrorism, if they take back their nationals, foreign terrorist fighters and their families, if they end occupation and illegal foreign presence on Syrian territories, if they lift the stifling, immoral economic blockade, and if they promote the efforts of the Syrian people in development and reconstruction. Thank you, Madam President. I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Madam President. We also thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Undersecretary General Griffiths for their briefings. We also thank Hassan Zeki, the Assistant Secretary General of the League of Arab States, for his remarks. Last week was the 11th anniversary of the beginning of the Syrian war, a horrific war that Assad regime started against its own people, who wanted to live in a democratic and free society. 11 years of war that inflicted irreparable damages throughout the country, a man-made disaster that left no single Syrian family untouched, a tremendous human toll and immense suffering that lasted to this day, as civilians continue to be the daily victims of brutal violence and indiscriminate attacks by the regime and its backers. Madam President, the only way to end this bloodshed in Syria is an inclusive political settlement on the basis of the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. The Constitutional Committee is the only mechanism put in place to advance the political track. Yet, it has been subject to the regime's delaying tactics and obstructions, while the Syrian opposition has displayed strong commitment throughout the process. The 7th round of the Constitutional Committee is being held this week and must produce tangible results this time. These meetings should also be held more frequently and in a result-oriented manner. We will continue to support the efforts of Special Envoy Pedersen for a political solution. It is critical that additional initiatives align with the letter and spirit of Resolution 2254 and support its implementation. Let us also underline that there can be no place for illegitimate formations and terrorist elements in the political process. It is absolutely clear that this would be rejected by the Syrian people. Ceasefire violations in Idlib and any interruption to the delivery of international humanitarian aid to this region would unleash a new humanitarian crisis, also obstructing any efforts for a durable settlement of this crisis. Let us reiterate once again, search for a military solution is a futile adventure and will have severe consequences first and foremost for the regime itself. Madam President, Turkey will continue its fight against terrorism and separatism in Syria with utmost determination. Due to the persistent wrongdoings and ill-advised strategies, Daesh remains a threat to neighboring countries before anyone else. We have on countless occasions highlighted the mistake of subcontracting the fight against Daesh to another terrorist organization, namely the PKK-YPG-dominated so-called Syrian Democratic Forces. We invite countries that support the PKK-YPG-led SDF to see the ethnic cleansing and the war crimes committed by this terrorist organization in northern Syria. Ignoring these facts is incompatible with any humanitarian value. It's also a flagrant contradiction and inconsistency in the fight against terrorism. This approach in no way will bring stability to the east of Euphrates. We would like to take this opportunity to once again put on record that our request for a UN investigation into PKK-YPG terrorist organization's attack on Al-Shifa Hospital remains unanswered to this day. Madam President, we cannot afford the humanitarian situation in Syria to be overshadowed by other new or protracted humanitarian crises. International community has an obligation to compensate for the recent decrease in humanitarian financing to the Syrian crisis. This is necessary in order to improve the conditions of the millions of displaced people living under difficult circumstances, especially in Idlib, and to avoid a new humanitarian catastrophe. The burden on the shoulders of the neighboring countries should also not be forgotten. Turkey has been doing beyond its share for years now, providing temporary protection to close to 4 million Syrians and serving as the single transit point for UN cross-border humanitarian aid to Syria. We will continue to facilitate cross-line aid deliveries as well. Yet, given the extremely precarious humanitarian situation growing worse day by day, cross-border aid remains with no alternative in scope and size. But above all, we need the international community to act in a principled and responsive manner to elevate the humanitarian crisis in Syria and to produce lasting solutions. As usual, we will not be answering the lies that we just had to hear from the representative of the Syrian regime. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Turkey, and I give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Madam President, Syria's humanitarian situation remains alarming. The UN estimates that 14.6 million Syrians need humanitarian aid. This represents a 9% increase over 2021. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the country's already fragile humanitarian situation. Given this dire humanitarian situation, where significant parts of Syria's civilian infrastructure have been destroyed, the imposition of unilateral coercive measures on the Syrian people has had disastrous consequences on all aspects of their lives and runs counter to certain aspects of Security Council Resolution 2585 relating to early recovery projects, which are critical to strengthening Syrians' resilience and allowing displaced people to return home. These measures have also impacted international and national humanitarian organizations' efforts in Syria. These illegal and disruptive measures must immediately end. Claiming to care about the difficult humanitarian situation in Syria while backing unilateral sanctions against the Syrian people is extremely hypocritical. The Security Council must work diligently to ensure that Resolution 2585 is properly implemented in a balanced and effective manner, particularly in terms of early recovery projects and the lifting of unilateral sanctions. We once again condemn the robbery of Syrian people's natural resources, particularly oil and agricultural products, in areas occupied by foreign forces. This criminal act is an obvious violation of Syrian territorial sovereignty, relevant Security Council resolutions, and the United Nations Charter. The Syrian crisis cannot be resolved without ending the occupation and uprooting the terrorist threats. Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity cannot be jeopardized in the name of fighting terrorism. Therefore, all occupying and uninvited foreign forces, including those of the United States, must leave the country immediately and without any conditions. We strongly condemn the Israeli regime's repeated violations of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Israeli attacks on civilian and civilian infrastructures in Syria on March 7, 2022 constitute clear violations of international humanitarian law. We call on the Security Council to hold this regime accountable for such acts of aggression and malice, as well as its blatant threats to use force against other regional countries, endangering regional peace and security. We support the continuation of inter-Syrian negotiations in Geneva, which are now taking place under the auspices of the Constitutional Committee. In this context, we welcome Mr. Pedersen's continuous efforts to bring the negotiations to a successful conclusion. There is no other alternative to pursuing a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned settlement with UN assistance, free of outside influence or pressure and without any artificial deadlines. We maintain our contacts with the Syrian government, the UN Special Envoy, and our partners in Astana format in order to end the crisis and alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people as soon as possible. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for his statement. There are no more speakers. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned so that the Council can continue in closed consultations, and I request that all observers leave the room once the meeting is adjourned. The meeting is adjourned.